So we are going to be continuing on in the book of Judges. Today we are going to be examining Judges chapter 2, verses 6 through 23. Last week we looked at the failure of the people of Israel to fully conquer the land as God had commanded them and to fully drive out the previous inhabitants. We learned some very important lessons for us today. We learned that when we live our lives for God, we must live our life His way. If we want to experience the blessings of God as Israel wanted, we have to live our life the way that God commands. Oftentimes we may look down on the Israelites, especially during the time of the Judges, and say that it was so easy, all you had to do was listen to God. But the fact of the matter is that so often we fall victim to the exact same kind of compromising that we often condemn the Israelites for. We seek the blessings of God. We want them. But then when living His way gets a little difficult or inconvenient, I should say, we become all too ready to make compromises ourselves. And the crazy part is that when we make those compromises and when we make those little shifts away from what God has called us to, very often we fully expect the blessings of God to still be upon our lives. I am sure that the Israelites still expected God to give them peace in the land, even though they had not expelled the evil influences from amongst themselves. So instead of living in the blessing, they were instead relegating to having these people be a thorn in their side and giving them problems. It is not at all crazy to think that those problems that started all the way back then are at least part, if not all, of the reason why we see Israel caught up in some of the same struggles that they have today. I don't say that to make it seem like they are bad or wrong or they have it coming to them, but I want you to see just how far-reaching the consequences of living a life that is easy will get you when you should be living for God fully and completely. I know that I have had consequences in my own life from compromise, and some of them have haunted me for years after the fact. So picking up from where we left off last week, we are going to be looking at the rest of chapter 2 today. To begin in verses 6 through 10, we get a more detailed account of the death of Joshua, who had led them into the promised land. In this, we see the influence that Joshua and the leaders that lived alongside him had. So well did Joshua point the people to God that his entire generation followed God even after he died. It was after his generation died out that the problems began. So in Judges chapter 2, beginning in verse 6, it said, "And when Joshua had dismissed the people, the children of Israel went each to his own inheritance to possess the land. So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died when he was 110 years old. And they buried him within the border of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres in the mountains of Ephraim, on the north side of Mount Gash. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel." Joshua lived a long and fruitful life, during which he led the nation of Israel to follow God. This shows the power that a strong leader can have in influencing people. I'm not even talking exclusively about following God. A strong leader with a powerful vision can cause people under their influence to follow their tenets even long after they have gone. We see this with political leaders who will get entire nations to mirror their beliefs for a time. This means that we must take care of who we allow to influence us, and we must take great care in how we use our own influence. Our influence can have far-reaching impacts that we may never even get to see. An example of this, a youth leader that I had in my younger days told me a story about a young lady who was in their youth group who hardly ever smiled. And even when she would smile, She refused to show her teeth. It was always just a very small smile. When asked about this, she would deflect and change the subject. But she finally shared with this youth leader that someone that she had cared about and who had influence in her life, in her earlier years, had told her that her smile looked weird. This person did not intend to harm this young lady and most likely meant it as a joke and didn't think much of it after they said it. But it's something that affected her so deeply for many years. This is because someone was careless with their influence. We cannot be careful of how we must be careful of how we use our influence so that we can build people up and not tear them down. So that we can teach them values and habits that will lead to their benefit. This is what Joshua did. In Joshua 24, verses 14 through 20, Joshua addresses the nation of Israel as he is nearing the end of his life. In this section, Joshua uses his influence over the nation of Israel to encourage them to live for God and to forsake the foreign false gods that had already started to worm their way into the people. This is how influence can and should be used in a positive way. In Joshua chapter 24, beginning in verse 14, it says, "Now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." So the people answered and said, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord and serve other gods. For the Lord our God is he who brought us and our fathers up out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who did these great signs in our sight and preserved us in the way that we went and along all the people through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out from before us all the people, including the Amorites who dwelt in the land. We also will serve the Lord, for he is our God." But Joshua said to the people, "You cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions nor your sins if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods. Then he will turn and do harm and consume you after he has done you good." Joshua tells the people that they are free to do as they wish, but that he and his house are going to serve the Lord. Then he tells them the consequences that will come from not serving the Lord. Specifically, that he will remove his blessings from their lives. And he will also allow calamity to fall on them. His warnings sound exactly like what is about to happen in the book of Judges. That God will do good to them if they follow him, but will cause harm if they do not. While they followed him, he drove out the people before Israel. But after they began to turn, he no longer did that. Instead, he would allow those people to stay and be a hindrance to them. It is things like this that Joshua does that caused the generation that lived with him to follow God, not just while he was alive, but even after he died. It was not until that entire generation had died out that the people began to turn from God. This is what we learn in verses 11 through 15. This takes place after the next generation rises up and takes control in Israel. They began to do exactly as Joshua warned them not to, and the result is exactly as Joshua warned them it would be. In Judges chapter 2, beginning in verse 11, it says, "Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals.
Them not to.
And they forsook,
And the result
forsook
is
the Lord
exactly
God
as
of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, so he delivered them into the hands of plunderers who despoiled them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. They turned from God and started worshiping the Baals and the Ashtoreths. These were just some of the gods that the Canaanites had, whom they were supposed to expel from the land. Meaning that if they had done as they were commanded, they would not have had the temptation to fall to these gods, since the people and their gods with them would have been gone. This forsaking of God and worshiping of false gods rightly angers God, and he not only removes his hand of protection from his people, he also begins to work against them. He gives them over into the peoples around them and allows them to be plundered and oppressed. I want you to think about this shift. Before, when they were following God, none of these people could stand up to them, and they were being consistently pushed out before Israel. But now, Israel could do nothing before these people. I am sure this was shocking for Israel. I am sure they had gotten used to winning, and now they couldn't. Many times we get used to the blessings of God in our life, and we begin to believe that these blessings come from us. I'm sure that the Israelites began to believe that they were just strong. They were a mighty people, and they could overcome whoever they needed to overcome, because after all, they had been doing it for years at this point. However, something critical had changed. In their self-assurance, they failed to see that they were successful because of the hand of God in their life. Once they turned from him, they lost that divine providence, and now they were working against God. The same can happen to us when we get the idea in our head that we can do things on our own, that we can live life on our own terms and we don't need God anymore, or we might not rely on him the way that we used to. Don't be shocked if you go off to do something in your own power and you find that your own power isn't enough. This is why we need to constantly keep our eyes focused on God, so that we never forget our need for him and his mighty hand in our lives. The Israelites allowed evil temptations to draw them away from God. We must be vigilant always not to allow the same thing to happen to us. So how do we avoid straying from God? Well, the most present and obvious answer that we learned from the Israelites is to actually remove the things from your life that would draw you away. The Israelites failed to do this, and it led them to worshiping something other than God. This means that we must not do what they did and actually remove the evil temptations from our surroundings. But there's another factor that is not directly stated, but yet implied in the text. This is a failure of leadership. I talked about influence earlier and using it for good and not evil. The people that lived with and led alongside Joshua did not worship these foreign gods, even though they lived alongside them, just as the next generation did. Yet they did not fall. What was the difference? That generation was taught the things of God by their leaders, by men like Joshua and Caleb. Yet their children began worshiping other gods. Now, the obvious answer that you might say is, well, that generation that grows up didn't have Joshua or Caleb to lead them. You're right. But what they did have were the people who were led by Joshua and Caleb. The rest of that generation that did not turn away. The rest of that generation that continued to follow God. They rose up the generation that turned from God. The generation that did not stray was preceded by righteous men, and the generation that did stray from God was also preceded by righteous men. So what happened? What made the generation that strayed different? The only explanation that makes sense to me is the failure of the previous generation to properly pass on the values and beliefs to their children in the same way that they had received it themselves. The parents did not teach their children to have a relationship with God and follow God the same way that their parents had done for them. They failed to use their influence in a positive way. This should stand as a warning to all of us who have children or hope to have children someday. If you want your children to follow the Lord as you have to be the one to teach them that. You have to be the one to model the kind of relationship in your life that you desire for your children to have with God. Let me be clear on what I mean by this. Just bringing them to church once a week is not enough. If you want them to have a relationship with God, a relationship with God is more than just showing up on Sunday. You must also acknowledge God throughout the week. Teach them about God. Read Bible stories with them and tell them about the things that God has done for you personally. Obviously, do this in an age-appropriate way. As one of my mentors is fond of saying, more things are caught than taught. Meaning you cannot send your kids to church once a week and expect that alone to breed a relationship with God. You must show them the way yourself. Otherwise, all you do is teach them facts about God and not about who God is or how to have relationship with Him. You teach them to know of God, but not to have relationship with God. As we are about to see, the Israelites moving forward knew enough about God to call out to Him when they were in trouble. We see this in verses 16 through 19. Even though the people had turned from God, they still knew to cry out to Him in times of trouble. So their fathers had clearly not failed in teaching them anything. They just did not show them how to have proper relationship with God. In Judges 2, beginning in verse 16, it said, "Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hands of those who plundered them. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked, in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers, by following other gods, to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way." Even though the people were wicked, God was still so gracious and good to come to their rescue when they called on Him. Time and time again, and every judge that God would raise up, the following generation would become more corrupt than the one before. Yet all the while, God would still answer them. Many times I've heard people say that the God of the Old Testament feels different than Jesus. I've heard Christians and non-Christians alike say that Jesus is all about love and compassion, and He cares for people. But God in the Old Testament, He's all about wrath. He's all about judgment. He seems so much harsher than Jesus. They almost feel like two different people. But here is a shining example of, yes, God's judgment in dealing with His wayward people, but also His great love for His people. Even though they turn from Him time and time again, He still comes to their rescue, knowing full well they are just going to turn from Him again. All because of His great love for His people. We often forget that part, that God knew from the beginning just how many times Israel would turn from Him, and yet He still chose to save them every time, knowing that they would do it again. It is not as though God would save them through a judge like Othniel and say to himself, this time they're going to stay loyal to me. This time I've shown myself to them. This is going to be the turning point. They're going to stay with me this time. Or when He used Gideon or Samson or Deborah or Shamgar or Ehud or any other judge. Each time he knew that they were going to turn away from him again. And yet he chose to save them each time anyway. That is the love and the mercy of God, even the God of the Old Testament, the God that we serve. And if he would do that for wayward Israel, he will do the same for you. Even though we may screw up in our lives, we may turn from God and serve our own flesh, we fall into sin, but he is still right there, ready to help pick you up. Again, if you would just call on him. Even if it is not the first time you have strayed from him, even if it's far from the last time that you will stray from him, he is still gracious to come to your rescue. That does not sound like a God who is not loving to me. Of course, God is loving, but he also is just and does not tolerate evil, as we see in verses 20 through 23. God makes very clear that he is not at all pleased with Israel's choices and that there would be consequences to those choices. This also shows us that some of the promises that God makes to us have conditions. And if you fail to meet those conditions, then not only will you miss out on the blessings of the promise, you also open yourself up to punishment for failure. In Judges chapter 2, beginning in verse 20, it says, "Then the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not heeded my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord and walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. Therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them into the hand of Joshua." God promised that he was going to drive out the people before Israel. Yet Israel failed to hold up their end of God's promise. And therefore that promise was rendered void. Not because God changed his mind, but that was always the standard. It is perfectly understandable if God says, if you do X, then I will do Y. It is perfectly reasonable for him to then come to you and say, you didn't do Y, so I'm not going to do X. God also uses this as a means to test his people, meaning that he is leaving them the choice of who they want to follow. The God who had delivered them out of Egypt and had delivered them from so much in the time since, or these false gods of the Canaanites who had never done anything for them and could not because they weren't real. It's the same choice that is given to each of us every day. Are we going to choose to follow God, or will we follow one of the myriad false gods of this world that are shoved in our faces all the time, all around us? God's desire is for us to choose him, but often we don't. Sometimes the temptation is just too great for us to bear, or sometimes we just fail to see our need for God. But we cannot allow our pride to make us think that we have no need of God. We are in need of him just as much today as they were back then. As soon as God removed his hand from them, they began failing and being delivered into the hands of the enemies. All of this because a generation grew up that did not follow God and instead found it easier to follow the gods of the land. I think it's safe to say that we are coming into a generation that finds it easier to follow the gods of the land rather than the God of the Bible. Now, these gods might not be the Baals or the Ashtoreths. Instead, they are gods like moral relativism or radical gender ideology or many other things. At the end of the day, all of these ideas can be summed up as a worship of self. I think that is the most prevalent false god that exists in the world today. the worship of ourselves, that we can be anything that we want to be. We get to decide who we are. We get to decide what is right and wrong for ourselves, what is good and what is evil. In doing so, we put ourselves in the place of God. So how do we stop it? How do we stop this generation from turning away from God, as so many others had, as the Israelites had so many times? It comes back to influence. We must use the influence that we have to lead as many people as possible into right relationship with God. We must begin with our own families, those close to us. We must teach our children not just who God is, but how to have relationship with Him. This means you are going to have to model it in your own life so that they can see it. Talk with your children and those who are close to you about what God has done for you. If we do this, we can raise up a generation that follows God. We heard the message that Hannah had earlier. Her goal is to have this generation in Cambodia be the one that changes the nation of Cambodia. We are always one generation away from turning from God, but we are also only one generation away from turning to God in a more meaningful way than we had before. We have to use our influence to draw people to God before anything else, above all else. You see, if we confine our relationship with God to just Sunday morning, then we are going to raise up a generation that will stray from God. I'm not telling you that it might happen. I'm telling you that it will happen. And I'm also telling you that as a pastor, as the one who has been given the responsibility of leading this flock, that it is not enough to only bring your children to church and expect that to be enough to have them follow God the rest of their lives. I take my responsibility of teaching and leading very seriously. But if there is one thing that I have learned in my time of ministry, it's this: I have so much smaller of an impact on your children than you do. I worked in youth ministry for over 12 years before coming here, and I continue to work with youth now. But me seeing your kids once or twice a week for a couple of hours can never have the same kind of influence that you will have as a parent who sees them every day. You have great influence in your children's lives. You have great influence in your friends' lives, more than I will ever have. The question is, how are you going to use it? Take your responsibility seriously. Do your best to not just teach your loved ones facts about God, but also show them how to have a deep and meaningful relationship with God. This is something that my wife and I have taken to heart. We find time daily with our oldest to do time of devotion with him so that we can talk to him about who God is, what God has done for him, what God has done for the world, and what that means to him and what he thinks about it. That is a small way that you can work with your children. And if your children aren't at home anymore, whomever you have contact with, these are the people that you need to live your life in front of. These are the people that you need to be open about your relationship with God with. We talked in Sunday school earlier about how, yes, living your life, living your Christian faith out in front of everybody does open you up to ridicule. And you have to be willing to risk that. Because if you hide your faith from your family, if you hide your faith from your friends, if you hide your faith from your children, from whoever it is, you are not using your influence for good and to lead them into relationship with God. Instead, you are teaching them that it is okay to hide your relationship with God. And if you hide your relationship with God for long enough, you're going to find that it goes away. But here's the good news, is that you might say, well, I'm scared to use my influence. I'm scared to point people to God because what if I get it wrong? What if I mess up? Well, when you fall short, and trust me, we will all fall short in this area. None of us are going to be perfect in using our influence exactly the way God is wanting us to use it. None of us are going to be able to live our lives exactly the way God wants us to every single time. But the good news is what we learned right here, is that even when we fall short, even when we screw up, we know that God is right there and is ready to pick you back up again when you fall. Whether it's the first time you fall, or it's been so many times you can't even count anymore, he is still gracious to save us because his love for us is so great. So knowing this, knowing that God has your back, knowing that God is faithful and just to pick you up again when you fall, I want to encourage and challenge each and every one of you. Use your influence the way God would have you use it. Each and every one of us is born with influence. We have influence over people. You might look at somebody and say, well, I don't have influence because I can't do whatever this person does. I promise you, each of us have influence in people's lives. The people that are close to you care about what you say, care about what you think. So use that influence to point them to God. Use that influence to foster relationship with God. More than just showing up to church on Sunday and learning facts about God. Show them how to have relationship with God. Show them how to draw near to him. Because it happens on more than just Sunday. And if we all use our influence the way that we have been called to use it, this generation that we raise up will follow God. And that is the goal. That is the ultimate goal. To raise up a generation that follows God even closer than we did. But if we want that to happen, it doesn't happen on its own. You want to build a generation that follows God, you actually have to build it. And God is right there with you to pick you up if you fall. Let's pray. Father God, I love you. You are great. You are gracious. Lord, I fail so many times. I try to live for you and I fall short, but you are gracious and you have picked me up and you have forgiven me and you have dusted me off and told me to keep going every single time. And Lord, you are faithful to do the same for each and every one of us. So Lord, I pray we would each begin to use our influence the way you have called us to use it. I pray that we will raise up the next generation that will follow you, not stray from you. Lord, may we model our lives after you, and in so doing, teach those around us what it means to have relationship with you. Lord, I ask this in your mighty and precious name. Amen.